You are listening to Watchman Internet Radio. Today is February 1st in the year 2019. We're going to talk about the King of the North as well as the King-fearsome countenance. But first, we're going to dance the jig. That's right. It's Irish Day. I love that Irish music. Yeah, that brings back memories. I used to live in Southern California in San Diego in the mid-'80s, and there was this coffee shop called Drowsy Maggie's in the North Park area of San Diego. And we used to go over there, friends from the congregation. We'd go there after a meeting. It was a coffee shop. They didn't sell alcohol. So, you could sit there and have a cup of tea or coffee and a piece of carrot cake. And the one house rule they had live music. The one house rule was you could not use any amplification. So it was all acoustic music. They didn't even use microphones. But this one band played there. I can't remember their name, but they were really good Irish folk music band. And it had a female singer, and they played authentic instruments. And they just fantastic. I don't know if you can find stuff like that anymore. Drowsy Maggie's, of course, went out of business a long time ago, but I remember, that was the Central Congregation. That's where Mark Sanderson used to go. That's where I met him way back in the days. And speaking of Mark Sanderson, he gave a talk at the annual meeting, and they just put this up on JW Broadcast. I guess it's the third segment of the program from the annual meeting. And Mark's talk was about Russia as the King of the North. I thought they'd said it all in the previous program I had done on that, but no, there was another segment. And they brought out some of the persecution that's going on in Russia against Jehovah's Witnesses, how some 70 brothers and sisters are in various stages of house arrest or actual incarceration. And of course, this is all to back up their idea that Russia is the King of the North. Russia and her allies. They keep saying that, Russia and her allies, but they never say who her allies are. Anyway, they don't really go into depth in the prophecy of Daniel. They just barely make mention of the fact that the King of the North will enter into the land of the decoration, and many lands will be made to stumble. while the land of the decoration is identified as Christ's congregation, which I believe is true. Originally, that term was used applying to the land of Israel. It was physically beautiful land, a land flowing with milk and honey, but it was also decorated by Jehovah. It is where he chose to place his name, especially the city of Jerusalem. And it applies symbolically to the Christian congregation as well, because as I've mentioned a number of times, Jerusalem is where Christianity began. It's where Jesus gave his life. It is where the Holy Spirit was poured out upon the 120. And so Jerusalem, or the land of decoration, becomes a symbol for what belongs to Christ. Some years ago, or 20 years ago, with the Pay Attention to Daniel book, the Watchtower claimed that the Nazi king of the North went into the land of decoration. And they explain that in terms of Hitler's persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, which is well known. And even the Holocaust Museum memorializes the place of Jehovah's Witnesses and their purple triangle. But now here the Watchtower, even acknowledging that, is claiming that this other king of the North, Russia, is also going into this land of decoration. So you have two different kings of the North, is that it? How can that possibly be? The Nazi king of the North went into the land of decoration, and now in the interim, when the Soviet Union was the king of the North, and now you have another king of the North, Russia and her allies, and they go into the land of decoration. You know, if it weren't tragic, it would be comical, the way the Watchtower has tried to, well, what's it say in Isaiah? That they're on a bed too short, trying to cover them, a bed too narrow, trying to cover themselves with a sheet or a blanket that is too short. They just can't cover themselves. They can't get comfortable. And so every few years they try to bolster their previous view and paper over the air, but it doesn't really work. And they become more and more vague. It's almost a godsend to them that Russia persecuted Jehovah's Witnesses. As they pointed out, this has never happened before, that one political entity would shut down so much of Jehovah's organization. So many congregations and the branch facility, they just confiscated everything, an assembly hall. We'd have to agree with them. That's never been done before. Well, the real problem is the reason the Watchtower cannot get comfortable, cannot cover itself, is because of this delusion that Christ came in 1914. And they have to cling to that. They have to try to bolster that view. It's like whitewashing a shabby wall, putting more and more whitewash on it, right? Isn't that how it's symbolized in Ezekiel? So the king of the North presents a timeline in verse 40 where it says, in the time of the end, the king of the South will engage with him, the king of the North, in a pushing. And in verse 41 it says, he, the king of the North, will enter into the land of the decoration. Well, the Watchtower has always said that sometimes prophecies cannot be fully understood until after they are fulfilled. And so the Watchtower is quite certain that these prophecies have been fulfilled. And since this very same prophecy also says that the book of Daniel is sealed up until the time of the end, you would think that since we are supposedly deep into the time of the end, that it would be an open book. And you wouldn't need to have revision after revision to try to figure it out. But that's too sensible, isn't it? But what if the prophecy hasn't been fulfilled yet? What if we are not in the time of the end? then attaching some sort of fulfillment to a prophecy that hasn't been fulfilled yet is going to be very misleading. And that is exactly the dilemma that the Watchtower is in. There are a lot of things that just simply cannot be explained in terms of the Watchtower's explanation. For example, if we just back up 10 verses where the king of the north and the king of the south have a confrontation, and the king of the north is humbled, and he goes back and hurls denunciations against the Holy Covenant, and he acts effectively, and he goes back and will give attention to those leaving the Holy Covenant. And then it says, arms will stand up proceeding from him, and they, plural, will profane the sanctuary, the fortress, and remove the constant feature. And they, again, plural, will put in place the disgusting thing that causes desolation. Well, that is interesting. That should perk up the ears of Christians, because that is a key feature of Jesus' prophecy regarding the conclusion of the system of things, or the time of the end. Jesus said, when you see the disgusting thing that causes desolation, then know that the end of Jerusalem is near, and Christians are commanded to flee. Well, we know that had a fulfillment in the first century. The Roman armies came, and they went into the temple, but then they withdrew, and that was a signal for Christians to leave the area. And sure enough, the Romans came back and desolated Jerusalem and killed 1 million Jews who were crammed into the city celebrating the Passover. But here it is, referring to this king of the north and the king of the south and their confrontation, but they're working together. Arms will stand up from him, the king of the north, and they will profane the sanctuary, the fortress, and remove the constant feature, and they will put in place the disgusting thing that causes desolation. So the king of the north and the king of the south set up a disgusting thing that causes desolation. Well, the Watchtower says the thing that causes desolation was the League of Nations, set up in 1922. And supposedly at that time, the king of the north was Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, before Hitler came to power. But Germany did not help the United States or Britain set up the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, really, come on, it could not have been the disgusting thing, because it went out of existence as soon as World War II began. So that doesn't make any sense. But the Anglo-American duo, made up of the British Empire and the American Republic, formed this special partnership, not during World War I, but during World War II and afterwards. And sure enough, they did set up the United Nations, which I believe at some point will be the disgusting thing that causes desolation. Now, I mentioned we're going to discuss a little bit about the king fierce in countenance. And you really have to appreciate that all prophecy is harmonious and interwoven. And Daniel especially, it's as if each prophecy enlarges upon this basic theme, which is God's kingdom coming and taking over. We have that portrayed in the second chapter of Daniel with this immense image, and the kingdom stone strikes it. That's the most simple of the prophecies presented. Then in the seventh chapter, the wild beast that brings the holy ones to ruin. And the Son of Man comes and vanquishes the beast. Then in the eighth chapter is this king fierce in countenance. And he confronts the Prince of Princes, Jesus Christ. But it is interesting that this king fierce in countenance, also called this little horn, he comes into the land of the decoration, exactly as the king of the north. And he causes some of the stars to fall to the earth. And as I mentioned, he exalts himself against the prince of the army and takes away the constant feature, and the established place of the sanctuary is thrown down. When does this happen? Well, it says down in verse 19, the angel says, "Here I'm causing you to know what will happen in the final part of the denunciation, because it is for the appointed time of the end." So here we have the king of the north during the time of the end comes into the land of the decoration. And here we have this little horn identified as a king fierce in countenance coming into the land of the decoration during the time of the end. It doesn't take a great deal of intelligence to connect these two, does it? But the Watchtower doesn't do that. It's not that they lack intelligence, I don't think, but they're not being honest. Because in their explanation of this king of fierce countenance, they identify this little horn as the Anglo-American dual world power. And they say that he came into the land of decoration during World War II. And they explain that the British Commonwealth banned and persecuted Jehovah's Witnesses throughout the British Commonwealth. You know, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted in the United States for their not participating in the war. So here we have two prophecies outlining the exact same thing. Daniel, the 8th chapter with King Fierce in Countenance, is much more detailed. But according to the Watchtower, it is two separate fulfillments. There's a problem there, isn't there? And as I mentioned, the real problem is the fact that the Watchtower claims that the time of the end began in 1914. My perspective is the time of the end has not begun. It is imminent. And we're going to see something that no one can imagine. It is totally unexpected. Regarding this king fierce in countenance, or fierce-looking king, as the Revised New World Translation states, it says his power will become great, but not through his own power. He will bring ruin in an extraordinary way, and he will be successful and act effectively. He will bring mighty ones to ruin, also the people made up of the holy ones. And by his cunning he will use deception to succeed. And in his heart he will exalt himself. And during a time of security he will bring many to ruin. He will even stand up against the Prince of Princes, but he will be broken without hand. Well, just as the king of the north comes all the way to his end and Michael stands up and there's no helper for the king of the north, this fierce king will come up against the Prince of Princes, Michael, Jesus Christ, the Son of Man. He will be broken without human hand. Now, I noticed in the Watchtower's latest annual meeting, they're still going on about the king of the north and the king of the south are together when they're destroyed. And that's simply not true. On the one hand, the Watchtower claims that they have the sole obligation and ability to interpret Scripture. Surely they don't have the sole ability to read the Bible. Everyone who is literate can read the Scriptures for themselves. Why not just let God's Word speak for itself? So if you read the concluding verses in that 11th chapter, it says the king of the north comes all the way to his end, singular, and there's no helper for him. It doesn't say they come to their end and there's no helper for them. singular, king of the north. The king of the south is subjugated by the king of the north prior to his coming all the way to his end. And that is envisioned in this 8th chapter. This deceptive king brings many to ruin. Who is the many? Well, it's the powerful ones of this world, leaders of nations. This king who becomes powerful but not by his own power, I believe will be the United Nations. That the United Nations at present is merely like a placeholder. It has the bureaucratic infrastructure to become a world government, but as long as the nation states insist on their own sovereignty, then the United Nations is really a paper tiger. And it is. It has really no power. But it can be powerful, this United Nations, if the present system is made to crash. And so the bankers who really pull the strings intend to crash the whole financial system and the whole economic system and create a new system devoid of the encumbrances of nation states. We see it's like a test model now in Euroland. The nations of Europe were conned into discarding their national currencies in favor of the euro. And a few years into it, they found out that they have no say over their budgets. It's all controlled from bureaucrats in Brussels. And that's what we see, this uprising with the yellow vest. That's really the underlying reason for this backlash of nationalism. We see it in Italy, Hungary, Poland, began in the United States with the election of Donald Trump. People don't want this globalist system. Well, they're going to get it. Right? Let's go back to that verse. And during a time of security, he will bring many to ruin. That's where we are now, a time of security. Yes, it's true, there are wars here and there, but you wouldn't know it by people living in the United States or Europe. They go on about their lives and, it's no big deal. But that can change very quickly. We saw what happened after the attack on 9/11. The week after the crash, Wall Street was shut down to prevent the Wall Street and the stock market from crashing. They lowered the interest rates dramatically to pump money into the system to prevent a global financial collapse. And I think that in some ways that was kind of a test run. They can easily orchestrate a false flag and set off a dirty bomb or something and just blow up the whole financial system and bankrupt all the billionaires, bankrupt the nations that are hopelessly in debt during a time of security. Well, the Watchtower has no explanation of how the Anglo-American duo brought many to ruin during World War II, or how the holy ones were brought to ruin, or how on and on. The Watchtower seemed to be quite taken back with the fact that Russia was able to shut them down and liquidate their holdings. They said it's never been done before. Over 100,000 witnesses were affected by this. Well, consider that on a global scale. What if Warwick, their headquarters, and Gilead, and all of that is shut down? I noticed during this annual meeting talk, they kept emphasizing the importance to be ready for persecution and to be ready to follow instructions that will emanate from Jehovah's mouthpiece on earth. Well, that's not going to happen. Watchtower is going to be silenced, really. If you go to the 43rd chapter of Isaiah, and that chapter has a lot of significance for Jehovah's Witnesses because verse 10, 11, and 12, that's where Jehovah's Witnesses have taken their name. God says, "You are my witnesses, and I am God." But that prophecy has to do with God repurchasing those who are called by his name, repurchasing those whom he is going to sell into captivity as payment for their transgressions. And that hasn't happened yet. That's what will happen when the King of the North comes into the land of decoration. It will be a global shutdown. I believe that the constant feature is what the Watchtower says, the preaching work. And they say it was shut down because in one small part of the world, Jehovah's Witnesses have been silenced. Well, it's interesting, the closing words of that 43rd chapter. Remember now, in Daniel, it says that this fierce king will stand up against the prince of princes. So who are the princes? It is the chosen ones. They're the sons of God who will rule with Jesus. But they're not perfect as was Jesus. So Jehovah has to correct them. And now verse 25 of Isaiah 43, I am the one who is blotting out your transgressions for my own sake, and I will not remember your sins. Remind me. Let us bring our case against each other. Tell your side of it to prove you're in the right. Your first forefathers sinned, and your own spokesmen have rebelled against me. So here's Jehovah's remedy. So I will profane the princes of the holy place, and I will give Jacob over to destruction and subject Israel to insulting words. That is what Daniel is talking about when the holy ones are brought to ruin. Their ministry is finished, but then Jehovah repurchases them and brings them into the kingdom, and a new phase of God's work is initiated then. I've spoken a lot about Jesus visibly manifesting himself to the chosen ones. That will occur after this repurchase. And that is what is intimated in the closing words of the 11th chapter of Daniel. In verse 44, it says, "But reports out of the east and out of the north will disturb him." Again, the king of the north. No mention of the king of the south. "And he will go into a great rage to annihilate and to devote many to destruction. And he will plant his royal tents between the grand sea and the holy mountain of decoration. And he will come all the way to his end, and there will be no helper for him." And that's the end of that 11th chapter, and the next chapter goes on. "During that time, Michael will stand up, the great prince, who is standing in behalf of your people, and there will occur a time of distress such as not occurred since there came to be a nation until that time. And during that time your people will escape, everyone who is found written down in the book." If you remember that this king of the north was the Roman Empire during the time that Jesus was on the earth. And you recall that King Herod, who was acting as an agent of the Roman Empire, he had received reports that disturbed him, that the king of the Jews had been born. And remember, the astrologers came from the east, from Babylon, following his star that kind of parked over Bethlehem. And Herod went into a rage and had all the boys under 2 years of age slaughtered to try to kill Christ. Well, in verse 44 there, the reports out of the east, just like the wise men from the east brought this report, and out of the north that will disturb him. And he goes off into a great rage. Well, what is this report out of the east? Well, the sun rises in the east doesn't it? And does not Revelation refer to the kings from the rising of the sun? Referring to these chosen ones at the time they're sealed. When Peter was talking about the transfiguration, he advised Christians to keep considering prophecy until a day star arises in your hearts. That's the end of prophecy. The day star is when they're called into the kingdom. They're confirmed, they're sealed. Jesus is like the rising sun, the rising day star from the east. And so these chosen ones that will see Christ will give witness. That's what the two witnesses witness to, that they have seen Jesus Christ. Wouldn't that be a disturbing report for this king who thinks he's ruling the world? So he will go off in a great rage to annihilate many, bringing Babylon the Great to its end. And he plants his tent in the place where the kings of this rising sun had been on earth. Meaning he dispatches them, he kills them, and thus he's like a squatter in the land of decoration. But these holy ones are then transformed into the spirit world and join Christ and help bring the King of the North to an end. I thought it was interesting that the Watchtower, with this annual meeting talk, they did mention that all of the holy ones will be with Christ in heaven before Armageddon. They didn't used to teach that, but I've been talking about that since the first edition of Jehovah himself has become king in 2005. But anyway, I guess that's it for now. I do want to mention a couple of things. I don't think some of you are getting the message. I don't allow commenters on my videos to leave hyperlinks to other websites or promote blogs or other videos. So if you post a hyperlink in your comment, it won't even be posted. And I think I'm going to take a few days off. I have some personal things that are piling up on me and I need to take care of. So I won't be talking to you tomorrow probably, and it may be a few days before I do another program. So thanks for listening, and until then.